microphone. Hello.
Hello. Welcome to Paradialectic. Today we are going to be covering what it means to have a mental health diagnosis, whether now or in the past, and kind of talk about mental health more broadly and be taking, especially the ways that mental health were viewed 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago, and talking about therapy, psychology, and ways of working with ourselves as an evolving technology, something that changes over time. And that means that how we perceive as people, as clinicians, how that changes over time and why that's important. So.
I am not a clinician. I haven't even really officially had a clinic on myself. I have never been professionally psychiatrically evaluated in my life.
I have.
Yeah, but I have been evaluating myself since I was a youth. And I think that's a thing that is pretty rampant. As for a starter, the self-diagnosis has never been, I don't think that has never been more popularized. And I think one of the factors of that is the memosphere of the internet.
Yes, and not just of ourselves, but sometimes of other people. And that's actually something that really concerns me. A big part of why you and I started Paradialectic is because of the kind of extreme ways that people respond to each other in social media. And I think that the way that social media, oftentimes in a very well-meaning way, discusses mental health issues tends to be really extreme, tends to be on one side of these dialectics or another. And to me, part of the reason why we're doing a podcast called Paradialectic is, to me, that adaptive middle, that dynamic range of ways of viewing ourselves and other people is important and is healthy. But before we dive into this, we did a podcast 2 weeks ago. I did a Paradialectic on Bitcoin.
And since Bitcoin has breached $23,000 in USD,
with 20,000 being the old psychological high. Speaking of psychology, I think this is really important because I've had a lot of people reach out to me since that podcast and ask me a lot of questions, and I'm always happy to talk about cryptocurrency, talk about Bitcoin. And something I really want to reiterate again and again and again is nothing that we gave ever is financial advice. That I'm talking about my own approach to Bitcoin, what I'm choosing to do, why I'm doing it. And the advice that I will always give is to always do your own research, to always, if you got anything from our podcast last week, the more you understand about Bitcoin, the more you're going to value it and the better choices you're going to make if you decide to buy it. That means that you're not going to sell it too soon. You're not going to hold on to it too long. But you're going to hold it based on what your conviction in it. And if you don't know enough about it, what you're going to do is you're going to sell it way too soon. So again, follow up. This is a great podcast. It's if you want to find a copy of it, if you hadn't seen it, it's over on Zach's YouTube page, and that is I Am Nonsenseman. Correct?
Yeah, it's Zach and What Army. YouTube.com/Zach What Army. But if you searched I Am a Nonsense Man, that'll take you to it.
Okay.
And I think you have to go to the live stream specifically to see that. So we were supposed to be joined by Chris Orozco, and we were going to wait to get into the meat of this before he arrives. He may arrive at any moment, or he may not. But all right, well, let's begin. Okay, so welcome to the Paradialectic podcast. Starting officially now. We're going to be talking about mental health diagnoses, and
mental health generally.
Yes, I am here with Eric Miller, PhD, a clinical therapist, clinical psychologist, and I am a nonsense man who has not been officially diagnosed, but has been observing myself more and more to have /be ADHD AF, as it were, and so I've been thinking about this topic a lot because it occurs to me that having mine never sought a diagnosis, and I think that a lot of there was when people think of ADHD, immediately the Ritalin and Adderall comes to mind, and the sort of trend craze like that I think was started in the 90s and is like still peaking now. That is like somebody thinks the little kid who can't stop fidgeting and can't pay attention in class. And it's seen as this childhood, early adolescence thing. And in my adulthood, I feel like it's become more overt to me, because there's more situations now where this is actually like, I don't want to say this is causing, but my default predispositions, or what seems to be going on with me neurologically, is like there's more evidence of it causing disorder in my life. Whereas before it was like, yeah, I'm not paying attention to things that are, and then but the idea of seeking medication has never appealed to me, and I've actually been pretty anti that personally myself. And I think that part of the thing that I was saying for years, because of that avoidance of being diagnosed and put on medication and becoming dependent on that medication, I would say that ADHD, it's like, there's no way to see it on a brain scan, so I would say like it's not real. And now I noticed more just through experience what the utility of diagnosis is, which I feel I could learn a lot from you. Why do we diagnose?
So that's I think that's evolved over the years, and I think that depends on who's doing the diagnosis and who's receiving the diagnosis. So the whole concept of diagnosis comes out of the medical model, and before therapy was valid, before people considered it to be something that was a science or something that was a professional career, it was medicine. Medicine is what you do. And people often saw that when someone was acting outside the norm as it being something wrong with them, because when you have a broken arm, there's something wrong with you. And when you have cancer, there's something wrong with you. So people are like, well, if this person's angry all the time, or this person's anxious all the time, or they can't pay attention, or they have a bad memory, then this means that there is a problem, a deficit, and we need to diagnose it because we need to fix it. We need to cure it. They're abnormal, and we need to help them become normal. And if we can't help them be normal, we want to hide them away or help them fit in. And not everybody who came from that model meant that, most people didn't mean for that to be harmful, but that our mental health responds to things very different than our physical health. In fact, well, actually not all that different, because think about it this way. Have you ever met somebody who got a medical diagnosis and they bought into it so heavily that their life got worse?
Yeah. I feel like the identity of unwellness is I don't want to say the cliche of slippery slope, but I've always thought that attaching to the identity of I am unwell. There's just more and more becoming evident that the placebo effect isn't just about sugar pills. No. It's about a brain that thinks something's supposed to get better, or I am in decline.
Right. And so we really get these feedback loops. And I work with a form of therapy, and we'll talk about this a bit throughout, called acceptance commitment therapy. And one of the key concepts is we can often fuse to ideas as if they are as real or more real than the world around us. And we don't need to be delusional to do it. It's part of how language works. So if you imagine holding a lemon in your hand, and you really do this along with us, and you imagine that there's a lemon, and you kind of squeeze that lemon, you kind of imagine what that lemon feels like. And if you're going to throw something, you normally get a kind of sense of the weight before you throw it, so you know how hard to throw it. So kind of imagine, you might want to do this too, like imagine holding a lemon and kind of imagine how heavy that wet lemon would be. So if you're going to throw it against the wall, like how hard you'd have to throw it, right? And when you run your thumb over that lemon, like what do you notice?
It has a lemony texture.
Right. And what is that texture? Is it kind of like, is it rough like sandpaper? Is it waxy? Does it smooth? Are there rivets?
I washed the wax from the grocery store off, but it has a glossiness. It would shine in the light. It's not smooth. It has a lemony texture.
Right. So if you now take this lemon, you kind of bring it to your mouth, and you bite through that lemon, you bring it up, and you let that juice flood your mouth. and you kind of crunch through the seeds, like what happens?
The same thing that happens when you think about the warhead candies,
right?
Sour warheads.
Your mouth kind of puckers up, and your mouth might have watered a little bit. Now, I didn't ask you to have your mouth water, and I didn't ask you to pucker up. It happens. And it doesn't happen to everybody who does that exercise. And if it doesn't happen, that's important too. But when you do that, this is your body responding to language, is responding to imagery. And this is what gives language weight and meaning. And so we know that lemon's not in the room because we can look in our hand and see it's not there, but our body still responded like it was true. And this is just one way to demonstrate how the placebo effect takes effect. But when you get a diagnosis, or when you believe that there's something wrong with you, you don't get that confirmation that there's really not a lemon in your hand. You begin to feel the effects of that diagnosis, and it can become a feedback loop for certain people. So this is why diagnosis is really important, and how we talk about diagnosis is really important. And so does that kind of answer your question?
Yeah, about the placebo effect, I have, so the very thing that I avoided in having this sentence that I now am saying out loud more often, that I have ADHD, as opposed to that's not real. I'm a special person. I'm just a special. We're all special persons. And given the right circumstance and being put in corresponding games to how I am and my brain tends to function, then things would be more conducive and it wouldn't be a disorder. And, so I was blaming the games that I was in the society, but now it's like I'm 32 years old and I'm noticing some areas that I really want to show up less ADHD-ly.
So you want to be able to focus, you want to be able to persist, you want to be able to keep your attention on something for a period of time for your own good, and you're finding that it's hard for you.
Yeah, and the big defining thing is that I don't seem in control of just how much of a predisposition to veering and tangenting off I have, and I would really like to at certain times, because there are times when it's a superpower, like when I do rambling stand-up comedy, freestyled stand-up comedy performances sometimes, and I've been told, and I enjoy the act of like, how the hell did I get on this subject, and just like, so that's cute and can be funny and neat. When it's not, is like driving, having a real difficult time doing what I say I'm going to do at the time that I said I was going to do it. I find, so my awareness and my seeing that, it's like I'm seeing it more, but being as I had over a decade of being in denial of the existence of this, but really I changed my idea a lot from our conversations, that it's like, it's a model, it's a list of criteria that you meet, and that there's hope to not meet that criteria at some point. Right.
So there's a lot there to unpack. So let's kind of like kind of get into what we're going to end up talking about a bit. So one of them is, I want to talk about a few different diagnoses. So we're going to be talking about ADHD. We're going to be talking about, which is actually more of a disorder of, or a way of functioning, a specific way of that a reward system in our brain functions. Is less of a different way of having attention. It's a different way that we experience reward, and we can talk about that. The other thing I want to talk about are kind of the more common things like anxiety, depression, getting caught up in anger, those things, what we used to call axis 1 disorders. They're basically things that kind of evolve during adulthood and cause difficulties in a very specific area of our life. I'd also like to talk a little bit about what we call personality disorders. These are things like borderline personality, narcissism, dependent, depressive. And I'm going to say the word disorder because this is kind of the language I use with the professionals I serve with. When I say disorder, I don't mean that there is something wrong with a human being. I really prefer the term pattern. So now that we have that out of the way, I'm going to try to replace the term pattern with disorder, because when you said you have superpowers, like part of what is uniquely about you is that you can pull ideas from 15 different places and then weave them into a story that cause people to think about things in a new way. And that is a superpower. That's absolutely amazing. And that is probably tied into that ADHD pattern, right?
Mm. Yeah, there's another moment where it's a superpower that I've noticed. I host this open mic stage at Burning Man, and it's highly unpredictable. You know, what will happen, who's going to show up at the time slot that they said they were going to be at. And I think I've done that job for 5 years now, maybe more. But I've noticed that one of the things that makes me really effective at that job is my intense, not just openness, but like chaos throws some other consciousnesses off. Like it's confusing, and it's difficult to accept that right now is not what you said it was going to be or what you expected it's going to be. And my mode of being is like, oh, all right. And I don't even like mention it when something, it's just, we just veer seamlessly into whatever's happening. And so that's, and there's moments like that in social, the party sort of thing. I do event coordination, and it's like, oh, this performer isn't showing up. All right, we're still gonna exist. And I don't spend time grieving that thing that didn't go as planned. So that's a superpower.
Right. So a lot of people who wouldn't have a diagnosis, or were kind of more on that, their pattern is more on what we call, so for example, OCPD, which is obsessive compulsive personality disorder, is what a lot of people think OCD is. So OCD is where people feel the need to do things in a repetitious pattern, because if they don't, they believe that something horrible will happen, right? They can also have an overt focus on germs, on safety. But OCPD, so obsessive compulsive personality disorder, or as we're talking about pattern, the person's the opposite of that. That they're really good, and their superpower is rules, structure, judgment, analytics, all or nothing thinking. And if they can structure their world and their life in this world, in the life of the people around them, so it is perfectly in order, it works so well. And these people excel a lot of times in the military, people with this pattern in their life, where someone with ADHD going into like Navy SEALs, Marines, that would be a lot harder for that individual, though someone might still be able to pull it off. So that superpower is on the other end of the spectrum. However, if you bring that person into a situation where they need to be more flexible, then you see that friction in their life. And so a lot of this has to do with, maybe it's not a disorder, maybe it's that you have strengths for certain contexts, and certain contexts are going to be easier for you compared to somebody else.
Yeah, and if your living situation matched or corresponded with you more. I worked for at least 5 years as a direct care worker in a residential group home setting with individuals who OCD was one. There was a comorbidity. There was several, but both were OCD was one of the more prevalent things. These idiosyncratic routines, these rituals that needed to happen, or it was a problem. And so I observed that behavior quite closely, and intensely. I was spending 16 hours there, 16-hour shifts, and I was there midnight. And so I got to observe that. And I never really thought of it though, as like the opposite of what I call like my squirrel consciousness, like highly distractible. You chase, chasing many of the streams of stimuli and thoughts that come up, as opposed to, would you say, like needing things to happen a certain way?
Right. So people with OCPD, not OCD, people with OCPD get highly distressed if themselves or others get into a situation where it's hard to follow rules, hard to keep things organized, hard to keep things in order. And it becomes a real challenge. And so when we talk about that, again, there's superpowers there. And this is true with anxiety. This is true with depression, which it doesn't seem that way when you're in it, but there's actually really healthy ways to experience what we call depression. Maybe we can talk about that down the road, but also things like borderline personality pattern, narcissistic personality pattern, that these are often vilified people. And this is one of the things that really frustrates me in social media, is that many times people will act as if that there's certain disorders people are diagnosed with that somehow makes them evil or bad. And I want to really separate people's behavior against other people as being mean or vengeful or malicious as being the disorder. And this includes, borderline personality disorder historically has been diagnosed more in women than in men, where narcissism historically is more diagnosed in men than women, but people of all genders can have either diagnosis. And here's the thing, personality disorders, they're trauma, that they come from trauma that happens to a child or a teenager, versus trauma, when trauma happens to an adult, numerous reactions can happen. Some of them are what people would consider disordered, PTSD being only one of those. But when something happens to kids, that forms what we often would call a personality disorder, which I prefer to call a strong personality pattern. And the reason why this is important is when someone is an adult and trauma happens, there's a few things. The reason why trauma hurts so bad emotionally is because trauma normally shatters our view of the safety, predictability, or fairness of the world. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I've heard it talked about as that the way you thought the world that you lived in is shattered conceptually to you. You now live in a different reality,
right?
And you have to accept that fast.
Yes. And so one of the big ways in which that shattered is we often in our culture teach children that the world is just. And this is literally called the just world hypothesis. And so basically that says is you're told when you're a kid, if you're good, moral, smart, hardworking, part of the right group, hanging out with the right people, it doesn't matter what the goodness is that you're supposed to live, that somehow that protects you. And it will protect other good people in the world. So if you're good, good things will happen to you. And if you're bad, bad things will happen to you. So if you're driving your car and there's a horrible accident and you lose your arm and you're conscious during that, and you're like, wait a minute, I'm good, I'm hardworking, I'm all of these things. Why did this happen? And that's often what causes us to be shattered, because we then become very hyper vigilant to threat. And that's because the world used to be predictable. Now it's not. So that lizard brain, that more primal part of us goes, we need to protect you all of the time. And I can't let up. Right. So a big way that we treat trauma, and here, this is what, because this is something you asked me before we started. You kind of go, hey, when people get diagnosed with something like depression or PTSD, I don't often hear that they get past that. Right. And so something I want to absolutely assure people on is that most diagnoses, especially diagnoses that or patterns that come about from how you live life and what you experience, they can be gotten through. And I know this from personal experience. I know that from hundreds of people that I've worked with, and I know that's from my own life, that at different times throughout my life, I would fit the categories of different diagnoses. And I'm happy to talk about that because it's such a human thing to have happen. But that's an aside. So coming back to the trauma, part of the way that we treat trauma is that when something like that happens, kind of like when we imagine that lemon, when you bite into that lemon, your mouth waters. And if you don't like that experience, then you're going to try not to imagine lemons. But here's the challenge. If we go through our normal day and we get a bunch of new information, we're going to take time and we're going to process and think about that information. And it's almost like taking items and putting them on shelves in our mind. So we know where to find them and we can learn from that information and use it. And the more important the things are that we learn, the more time we're going to spend thinking about it, processing it, and putting it on shelves in our brain. But when trauma happens, it's almost imagine like you were running a rival to Amazon and you had this giant warehouse, but you had no computer system, had no labeling system, you had no shelves, but it was your life's blood. You had to get those packages and send them to the people who wanted them. But imagine that some of those packages were teddy bears and bean bags, and they're nice and they're flowers, but other ones had live rattlesnakes and poison and razor blades. You had to open every box until you found the one you wanted, and then you had to give it to somebody. And that's what it's like when we have a traumatic memory, is that we don't want to go back and we don't want to access those memories. And we often need help to do so. So good therapy when it comes to adult trauma is that we can, in a controlled fashion with someone we trust, go through and begin to process those and then deal with that strong, extremely strong emotional reaction that comes up along with it.
So with PTSD specifically, and Pandora says, I am personally stuck in survival mode. Also feel like my PTSD is not curable. So with PTSD, we think of single events a lot, and that it's like a sustained amount of time. It can be that your traumatic event was a sustained amount of time in a condition, that you are no longer in those dangerous or traumatic circumstances, and you're still running the alarm system of these old ways. But one thing that when treating these things, when treating PTSD specifically, does must you specifically revisit like the event? Like, do you have to figure out what it was?
So I actually really want to speak to kind of Pandora's thing specifically, because I imagine that there's other people out there who feel very much the same way. So sometimes when you've been stuck in strong emotion for a long time, and this can be depression, this can be anxiety, this can be PTSD, that feeling, because that feeling is so constant and comes back so many times, that it feels like, because I've had it for so long, because I've hurt so much, it's never going to change, and it can't change because I've tried all the ways that I know how to change. And I might have even sought out multiple therapists and not changed. And then there's a hopelessness that sets in. And so we're talking about dialectics here. We're talking about dialectics. There are certain situations and conditions that are much harder to heal than others. And that it's not always the right time for someone to find the therapist that they can work with, or to find their own meditation practice, or to find their own study or their own self-talk to move them through that. Other times they feel that alertness is so valuable to them, or even that depression is so real that there's good reasons why a person's not letting go of it. But here's the challenge, and this is one of the big things that keeps certain patterns stuck, and one of them is emotional reasoning, and it's one of the most challenging things to work with. So I myself, as any human being does, I've experienced things that have left me in great pain, and I've found myself in very deep depressions that have lasted months. I've experienced traumas that have left me in pain for months in different ways. And when we're in these places, those emotions can often make us feel hopeless. The feeling of hopelessness itself goes, I am the evidence that you cannot get better, because that's how the world looks to you right now. And this is the most dangerous thing about depression, is that it can feel like there's nothing's ever going to change or get better. And the stronger that feeling is, the more true that feels. And this is what we mean by emotional reasoning. And this is why it can be so powerful to have crisis lines, for example, to know that there's somebody out there that we can talk to that can get us through that acute feeling. And I highly recommend it. Crisis lines are not for that last moment place where you feel like everything truly is hopeless. It's for when you're a few blocks down from that feeling and you need someone to talk to. And if you ever need to find a crisis line, all you have to do is type in crisis line into Google, and you're going to find a crisis text line. You're going to find a crisis call-in line. But I do want to emphasize that just because something can change doesn't mean it's the right time to change, and doesn't mean that but it also doesn't mean that it can't change. And this is something that I see in people all of the time. So I work in a setting where I work with people who have usually been through complex traumas, sometimes literally dozens of traumas. Some people who have been depressed, deeply depressed, where they've been in inpatient hospitalization multiple times throughout their life. And I have had many people in those places graduate from therapy, and many other therapists have the same effect.
Yeah, so that's the dialectic if it's on a line, on one side is identifying with, accepting your diagnosis, your pattern, so much that you don't look at at the range of hope that there really is, to no longer meet that criteria, to no longer be repeating that pattern. You feel that there is just this bone deep, this is how I am, this is how I've always been, and this is how it's going to be. And then on the other side is on the other side there's hope. There's real hope. But the reason why it's a dialectic, and it's not just to be peddling purely hope and purely like you can change, is that there is such a thing as taking on too much what could be called healing or treatment process at one time.
There's also pressure. Sometimes there's a sense that like you have, like if you have, so here there's a huge dialectic within therapy, and it's that dialectic between acceptance and change. And either extreme, if your therapist is on either extreme and it's not working for you, I highly recommend finding a therapist that's a better fit. And I see Chris is here, but I want to finish this thought while it's still in my brain. So I sometimes see therapists that are so much about empathy and validation and acceptance that they're basically going, I know you're hopeless and I validate your hopelessness, and you're right, it is hopeless. And we're just going to help you cope with this pain, and you're just going to be in this pain, and you are this person with this pain. That to me is the thing that is most wrong about the medical model on a harsher side and a more analytical approach to therapy. But you can have this extremely empathetic, validating form of therapy that does the same harm, which is saying, because you're angry, it does mean everybody around you is wrong and bad. Because you are depressed, it does mean you're hopeless, and you just have to accept that. And we need to continually validate that. Or because you're anxious, that you always need to live in fear. That to me is a gutter, not the middle ground. The other side is wrong too. If you have a clinician where they're pressuring you to heal or change and be different, and saying that you just need to work harder, and they're not getting that you have things that need to be understood and accepted before you can go down that path. Because sometimes the things that are causing problems in our life, we're doing them to avoid worse problems that we don't yet understand. And so we always need to have that balance between acceptance and change. And to me, the most effective therapist, and I see therapists myself because I didn't study for it for almost a decade, because I don't believe in it. It's so helpful to have an outside perspective, and someone who's going to ask you different questions than you're going to ask yourself, someone with different ideas than you're going to ask yourself, and help you find that balance between acceptance and change in ways that sometimes can be hard for you to do when you're caught up in something. So I hope that kind of gets at that point, Pandora.
Hello, Chris Orozco.
What's up, fellas?
Shadow integration aficionado.
Entering at the end of that, and that was fucking awesome. Loved that whole thing. It's great conversation so far.
Yep, we're talking about diagnosis, and we have rephrased disorder to pattern. Chris, nice. You had an anecdote from your past of a period of your life where you had problems that you observe yourself no longer to have those problems. Would you mind?
Yeah. Specifically about this thing about context. And Brig, I don't know if it's you that came up with the, or not necessarily came up with, but Zach just relaying this through you, this idea that diagnoses really best serve the clinician. I think that's a fantastic little piece of insight. And my experience with it was when I was growing up, I had a lot of mental health problems, meant like depression, anxiety, PTSD, hopelessness, like a lot of the things. And I never wanted to get diagnosed. I never wanted to have anybody tell me that there was something wrong with me and that I needed something in order to fix this thing that was inherently wrong with me. And so I never much like the idea of being diagnosed as something. And when I discovered shadow integration, what I decided to do was I looked at all the different parts of myself that were creating the pattern. And I love the distinction between, I forget what the other word, but not calling it, maybe it's diagnoses and pattern, but using pattern. Yeah. So I would look at all the different parts of myself that were creating my depression and all the different parts of myself that were creating my anxiety. and all the different parts of myself that were creating my sense of hopelessness. And instead of a diagnosis, what I had was a series of symptoms, which, yeah, I was calling them symptoms. And so I would be like, okay, like, why am I doing this? Some part of me must think that it's better to sit in bed for a week than to go out and live my life. Some part of me must see this as the less threatening behavior to engage in. So I was like, okay, well then, if this is all I can do to stay safe, what's the scary thing out there I'm trying to avoid? And for me, it was chaos. I was terrified of chaos and the unknown. And so as I made peace with chaos and the unknown, suddenly I didn't have to stay in bed for weeks at a time anymore. And I could actually go out and live my life, and I could engage with things. And that worked for my anxiety. It worked for my depression. It worked for my PTSD. It worked for my hopelessness. And so the diagnoses can kind of like point you in the direction of understanding your symptoms and patterns. But ultimately, in my personal experience, you will still have to take a look at all the individual parts of your psyche that come together to create the patterns, and understand why they're doing what they're doing and what needs they think they're meeting, and help them find those needs in healthier ways so that the pattern can resolve itself. Right. And that has always worked for me. And I'm very, very grateful that I pushed back against the idea of diagnoses as a kid, because my mom wanted to tell me I had a chemical imbalance and that I needed all kinds of stuff in order to fix it. And she might've been right. That could have been true. But I fervently rejected that. And because of it, I was able to find a framework that allowed me to get better.
Well, and I think that's a really important concept, because when I'm talking with patients, and I'm working within a medical setting, and I'm really glad that we're moving more and more towards kind of this recovery model. And we're talking about this before you came on, Chris. And one of these things is when I talk to patients and I start to look at their life, the first things that I look to are, what are they doing? And the things I'm looking to are what I call the pillars of wellness. I'm looking to their sleep. I'm looking to how they're eating. I'm looking to how much they're working out. I'm looking to whether they're getting outside and whether they're meeting with people, and if they have meaning and structure in their life. Because how do you get the chemicals in your body? It's from the food that you eat. How do you move them and how do you produce them? It's from how much you work out. And when you're not moving and you're sitting on the couch, you're building up adrenaline. And because that adrenaline is there to keep you awake, it's there to fuel you. And if it doesn't have anywhere to go, it's going to become anxiety. It's going to become angst. It's going to become frustration. But if you're working out, it burns that off. You're going to sleep better. And same thing, if you're being social and you're getting this different input and you're getting other people talking to you, you're going to get different points of view and new stimulation. Everything that you do changes the chemical balance in your body. That's the nature of living. We're made up of chemicals. So how we're living is going to affect our chemical structure, and medication is only one way to address that. Now, that being said, there are a few diagnoses where, if they're accurate diagnoses, I'm actually going to use the term diagnosis rather than pattern here. So schizophrenia and extreme bipolar disorder, that they have such a biological foundation that if that's truly that biological cause is the root cause of those patterns in your life, we know that statistically, research-wise, medication is very helpful in those cases. That being said, people with extreme depression, anxiety can also sometimes be benefited from medication, but it doesn't have to be for the rest of their life for the majority of people who go on it. But that's not true for everybody. So,
yeah, it can be like a nice little leg up to help you get some more capacity.
Exactly.
Were there, before what we now categorize as psychedelic, like event therapy, like giving somebody a psychedelic event, and I think it's very important for anyone who was going to seek that. There'll be more legal avenues to do that in more places. Like it's very clear that it's happening.
There's actually many publicly traded companies now that are looking into ketamine, mushroom therapy, cannabis. And this is really kind of taking off in Oregon and Colorado, particularly. There
is a Michigan Progressive Health Ketamine Clinic here in Michigan, and ketamine's a particular one because that is both that is used in both ways. I see, and you probably know the better jargon of these categories, but there's these medicines, medications, treatments now that are we administer a a compound to give you an opportunity in this novel state to have a therapeutic event on the other side of which will help you. And then there, something that is taken across time to change your base state. And so your life will hopefully be more livable if we toggle with things like serotonin on a like a set in across months, as opposed to this 3-6 hour event on the other side of which you may have great progress.
Mm-hmm.
And so was that a thing before these? Like, was there something like, because I mean, there was such a thing as having talk therapy in a state, right?
So starting way back at Harvard in the 60s, Timothy Leary was at one point a highly respected, prestigious, more traditional psychologist who came up with several approaches to actually diagnosis and treatment. And then he had discovered LSD and began to test it there. He became a much more controversial figure. And he actually undid, unfortunately, a lot of the work that he was doing early on, because he became so outgoing and so extreme that the other professionals had to distance themselves from him. And it really set back research into these other compounds for a long time. And I'm not necessarily endorsing personally those therapies, because they're still being developed, and I think they kind of offer a lot of promise. And we had a question here again. What are my thoughts on cognitive behavioral therapy? What are your thoughts on hypnosis? So basically, whether you're talking about psychedelics or you're talking about, so I work a lot with it's called the mindfulness and acceptance-based therapies, and these are kind of based on what was behaviorism, very active theory. So Chris, when you're talking about when you were depressed, you realized that part of yourself was keeping you safe, and you realized that you needed to find a reason to get up and begin moving and begin doing something different. Well, that's that's behavioral therapy. We call it behavioral activation, and what I call now values-based behavioral activation. That if you can, even if you're depressed, and a lot of times when you're depressed, kind of the key to being depressed is that you lose the motivation to do things, and everything that you imagine doing, it feels like it's going to suck. And this is why it's so important not to validate, in the sense that you're elevating your feelings above experiment. Because when things feel hopeless, you don't want to do anything. You assume it's going to suck, so you don't do it. But I imagine that part of what you started to experience is when you went out, maybe it didn't suck as bad as you thought it did. In fact, maybe it was actually interesting. Right? Well,
actually, for me, it was this really interesting experience, because everybody would tell me that, like, if you get out and you go work out and you do all these things, you'll feel better. But my symptoms were so stuck in that I physically, like, couldn't move.
Yeah.
And so, like, there were times, like weeks at a time, where I couldn't even speak. And so what I had to do was through using the shadow integration formula that I use, is I had to, like, basically just be there with the part of me that was terrified of going out to the world.
Right.
And incrementally, like, I would start to feel safe enough to go out and try something. And then I'd come back into my safe zone, and then, like, nurture myself and take care of myself. And then I'd venture out a little bit further.
Yep.
And then eventually, once I could do that, then I would come out and I'd be like, okay, yeah, that actually wasn't that bad. Like, I actually had a good time. Like, people aren't that scary, and working out actually feels good, and all these different things. And so sometimes it can even take a little bit of work to get to the point where you can experiment. But then once you're there, then, like, yeah, the momentum builds, and it's just beautiful.
And so this is a long way to come back to what you're addressing, which is, to me, it is many times experience that changes a person, not just thoughts. But it's a dialectic as well. So sometimes you got to relate to your inner world differently. And that kind of sounds like what Chris was doing, is he began to kind of relate to himself in a different way. That allowed him to get up and have a different experience. And then as he had that different experience, he got into what I call a positive feedback loop. So instead of a downward spiral where he was becoming catatonic, it became an upward spiral where his life started to kind of move out. So things like psychedelics, things like meditative experiences, things like body work, things like cognitive behavioral therapy, these are all different ways to find different perspectives on what we've already been doing within ourselves, different ways of doing things in the world, and different ways of relating to our thoughts and feelings and self. And it's through these processes that that we begin to figure out, okay, what's important to us?
Mhm.
What's in the way of what's important to us? And then how do we act on that more in the world? Because if we don't act on it, then our life doesn't change. So a phrase I use a lot with my clients is, how you live is what you get.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. The first time that I heard the sentence, and this individual no longer met the criteria for PTSD, was somebody talking about an MDMA therapy.
Mm-hmm.
Such like that, and that changed my paradigm about disorder diagnoses, patterns, so much, because it's like to think, because we hear so much, I am,
Mm-hmm.
an acronym.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
My depression.
Yes. That, I mean, it's said so much, and no judgment on that, but that's why, which is one of the things of the internet has, especially social media platforms, have given us this opportunity to speak about the deepest, most important subjects, and there is no barrier of entry. Anybody can just go in, and anybody can make a meme. That, like, some of these memes will be like, my ADHD, my PTSD make me like, and it's like, and it's almost like you can switch this disorder for like Sagittarius. It's like this, it's this identity, it's this thing to expect this same thing from happening. I think that does cause some harm. And and this paradigm shift of medication to change how you are, as opposed to to give you an opportunity to go inside and do troubleshooting within. Like, hypnosis is an example of that I wasn't thinking of before. Also, we've been doing the cold shower, Wim Hof, and that is like a general anxiety exposure treatment that you can self-administer every day. Have you have it explained in that way?
I'm sorry, I was reading a comment and got distracted.
Oh yeah, I'd like to get into a lot of these comments. Yeah. How you live is what you get. That's an amazing quote. Thank you. Oh wait, a question.
So, up to talking about the ketamine experience.
Yeah.
So there's a warning here, and I think this is important generally, and this is true with any therapy, and especially with these newer ones. And I think there's sometimes a lot of money to be made when it comes to these more fad treatments. So what she's saying here is that a client of hers had been given ketamine in the hospital, and they weren't warned about the side effects, and that became a very intense experience for them, and they weren't ready for it. And this is where it comes back to again, Timothy Leary. When people have a poor set, that is a mental set inside themselves or in a bad setting around them, so being given a disassociative, sometimes experiences a psychedelic, without being talked about what that's going to be like, that can cause additional problems. But this also kind of comes back to what you're talking about. And I think this kind of comes back to Chris and why we're talking about diagnosis generally, which is how we relate to ourselves. What we identify with is one major way to identify, to work with ourselves. So if I say I am a Scorpio or I am somebody with depression, and that becomes my identity. It's like I'm putting on a suit. And one of the big aspects when I work again with mindfulness and acceptance-based therapy, so a big thing that I often do is when people are having an emotion, to learn how to de-identify from the emotion and then instead experience that emotion as an event. And this is something you can kind of play around with at home. So if you can remember being angry in the last week, or I can remember being frustrated in the last week, and you do that and try this on for size, like you're trying on some clothing, and go, I am pissed, or I am angry. And then imagine how you feel and how the world looks. And then you instead sincerely say, I am having the feeling of anger. And to know, and then notice that it is somewhere in your body. That experience can be very different. And I know when I try that on, at least when I say I am pissed, it's like there is red all around me. All of those people out there are wrong. I am right. And I am like, I have a just rage in my heart that I want to smite people with. But when I have the feeling that I'm having the feeling of anger, I realized I've had a lot of feelings. I've been angry before, and I haven't always exactly been right about my anger. Sometimes I thought I was mad at somebody because I thought someone said something, and then I'm like, they're like, no, dude, that totally wasn't it. And I'm like, oh, okay, that person's actually great. I really like him.
The distinction I use is like, Sorry, am I interrupting?
Go right ahead.
Cool. So the distinction I like to use is because like a lot of times you'll be dealing with certain emotions that people won't want to validate because they'll be afraid that like they're going to believe it. Like hopelessness is a really big one, where like to help somebody validate and integrate hopelessness in order for them to be like, but I don't want to say I'm hopeless. Like that would be a terrible experience. Like I don't want to do that. So instead, I like to go like, okay, well, how about just say part of me feels hopeless? How does that feel? And they'll go, oh my God, that's so good. Because it's like, it immediately disidentifies. And it's this thing about being identified with the awareness that looks at and cares for all the different parts of yourself, rather than being identified with the parts of yourselves or the experiences that they have as a whole.
Right.
And so that is, I love what you said there. That's absolutely huge. And so it's just making the simple switch of like, I feel hopeless to, or no, I am hopeless. Like, no, part of me feels hopeless, and that's okay. And I'm going to understand why. And I'm going to figure out what needs need to be met there.
And this is something kind of we were talking about last time you were on, Chris, and that is that we can look at ourselves of having aspects to ourselves. And I'd like to actually have a whole paradialectic on this, but there's a possibility that you can step and if you practice mindfulness and you sit and watch yourself for a time, there's a lot of different ways to come to this awareness. But you begin to notice that you have these different aspects of yourself and that they are already relating to one another. So I think a really common thing that most people have experienced in themselves, whether they meditated or not, is when they watch themselves worry. There's often a voice in their head going, this is going to turn out horribly. And then there's another voice in their head going, well, I don't think it's so bad. Shut up. And then that can go on for hours. And that's what keeps you up for 3 nights in a row. And what you can do, and I kind of think this is what you're talking about a little bit, Chris, is what if you just step into that fear and step into that part of you fully for a time? And that's both terrifying because, of course, it's fear. You don't want to step into it, but it can be kind of strangely rewarding. And kind of saying identifying as anxious is kind of like a half step that you never get out of. But if you can only step into that fear and own it and understand why it's there, and you can start to like have that part of you look around it out in the world and realize, okay, maybe this is not literally dangerous where I am right now, but there is danger out there. And the other part of you is like, yeah, there is. So let's have you ready when that kind of comes up. We don't have to get rid of you. I want you to be there when I need to run my ass off.
Yeah. And especially like, because letting go of identity is inherently terrifying. And so if you make an identity out of depression or anxiety or whatever it is for you, when it comes time to finally let go of that, you're going to make it exponentially more difficult than it has to be. Because you're not just letting go of a pattern, you're letting go of an identity.
Yes.
You're letting go of something that gives context to your whole being and your whole worldview. And it's the thing that lets you know how to engage with your life, and it keeps everything predictable and manageable and lets you know how to behave every day. And with that identity of the depressed person crumbling, you don't know what the fuck to do with yourself anymore. You don't know what's going on. Like, without my identity of the depressed person, like, what do I do? And that is its own version of discomfort and its own version of like existential terror at times. And so it's really, really important to watch what you make an identity out of, because eventually they're all going to have to go. And identity dismantling is inherently just really not a pleasant experience. So I really highly recommend people not form identities out of things that they're going to have to let go of later on.
But at the same time, I think for a lot of people, especially when we're younger, those identity are scaffoldings that can become a trap. And I think that's kind of the key. It's not bad to like take on a professional identity when you're a trainee in whatever you're doing, because that allows you to go, okay, here are the general things that if I behave in this way because other people before me behave in this way, I'm not going to fuck up so bad. I'm going to cause a problem. And so if you use that as a scaffolding, it kind of allows you to build your own way of interacting with things, but then you can let that scaffolding go. And for time, you might have to understand what it means to be someone with ADHD or someone with depression, because if you can then kind of have a scaffolding of how other people have either managed that or got out of it, you can follow in the path of other people who have gotten out of that. But then within that scaffolding, you need to find your own way of building your own kind of artwork there. If you're kind of building a sculpture or a building, and then you can let that scaffolding go. But if it becomes a trap, whether you put it on yourself or somebody else puts it on you, then that becomes really dangerous.
we're in like this era right now, and like particularly the next few months with vaccines rolling out. Like, I think we can identify this as like, this is the golden age of both rational and unreasonable paranoia is so abound. And I've had some dear friends in my life who I observe to have a pattern of extreme paranoia. It's always them, and there's always a sinister plot. But then there's an actual there's a real argument to be made of the rushness of the vaccine. Like, just make it about that. And so there's,
just because you're paranoid doesn't mean they're not out to get you.
Yeah, and but where is the sweet spot? It's almost like, and there are some where I can see where it's like, this is very much this person's pattern. This is the knee jerk for this thing to be the most sinister. And it causes real problems for people. And this is like really put us in a situation where I think some people, a thought that I have is I don't think I've ever heard someone identify themselves like we do with other things, like I'm depressive, I have bipolar. I don't hear many people say I have paranoia.
Right.
I have a problem with
occasionally people will. So, but it's rare because it's one of those things where depression can be a reason for not trying. And if the real thing is that you're afraid of taking a risk and failing, depression can feel safer, and therefore it's something that can protect the person. This is not why everybody's depressed. This is a certain pattern that certain people have, but it can be a purposeful handicap. It's just like same thing with chronic pain. Again, I have chronic pain. So I'm not dismissing pain that you can't see as not being real, but sometimes taking on that sick role is a way to avoid another form of distress that we can tolerate less, which is anxiety. With paranoia, to declare you have paranoia undercuts your credibility and undercuts your status. So I think fewer people are going to claim that as something where they're going to go, well, this is who I am and what I am. Yeah. Because then other people
paranoia is marketable. Paranoia is really marketable. Depression
in a different way. Yes.
Yeah. Depression, like no one's going to be like, look at all these theories I came up with my depression. Like, aren't these so interesting? Don't we all want to all adopt these? Like, nobody's going to do that. But when it comes to paranoia, people would be like, look at all these connections that I found of all these things. And everyone else would be like, oh my God, wow, that's amazing. You must be tapped into something. And then that creates another one of those feedback loops where you start believing you're paranoid more. And so I don't think people have all that much reason to admit that they have paranoia, but depression is so debilitating that you're going to admit it and you're going to want to try and get out of it because it doesn't really have a whole lot of payoffs.
Right. And at the same time, for example, I worked with a lot of people who've been in combat and overseas. And when a lot of people who've been to places where the world is truly chaotic much of the time and things are always being threatened, that they come back to civilian life and they look at everybody around them as not being concerned enough and being naive in the fact that they think that the world is fair and kind and nice and this is how people are. And I think this comes back into that flexible dynamic range that we've talked about a lot. So as a previous martial arts instructor, somebody with a CPL, so I have a handgun, that I'm aware of how brutal and unfair and random life can be. So I'd like to be prepared for it. But I also don't walk around like Kato is in my closet all the time, ready to throw a shoe at my head, because I want to enjoy life. And again, I think this is what we're kind of working towards with mental health is that flexible dynamic range. There is nothing wrong with anxiety. If we are actually being threatened, we really want to feel anxious because it's doing things that are setting our body up to defend ourselves. If somebody is really going to harm us or take something from us that we value, anger is extremely adaptive because that means that I'm going to go, fuck no, get the fuck back from that person taking something that's important to me. But if I get caught in those things, or I cannot have those feelings in me, this is where I have a pattern that's going to cause me to be inflexible and going to start causing problems in my life.
Yeah, and causing problems with our utterances and just memes that catch on, little understandings that take hold on the internet. Like, we don't know how much damage that does. And you talked about the marketability of paranoia, Chris. That made me think of just how monetizable it was for there to be this understanding of diagnosis as an identity, and how the they're being more widely known, that there is real hope, that there is a path to you no longer meeting the criteria of a diagnosis, like that's not as that's not as capitalized, right? Like it's because that means that there will come a time where you won't need help anymore.
Yeah.
You won't need medication, so it's like it's understandable why these things take hold. And then with okay, I thought of something of my own situation of where my identifying as like my brain is this way. I have tentacle octopus brain, and then the tentacles go everywhere. That I have before as a defense mechanism in a lot of social situations, and okay, so I would just warn people when meeting me or when we get into a situation that it's like, I'm not the one that you want to do the thing that needs to be executed in a certain way. I will let you down. I will make you hurt, and so I would broadcast, I would signal my incompetence in certain arenas, when the healthier, more honest thing is I tend to have difficulty, at this. And I think that applies to everything that any pattern that somebody may, take on an identity, but as there's more hope and progress, it's like, I tend to struggle with this more than people are, hey, I have this pattern, as opposed to like, I see, and I myself have sometimes been like, I have anxiety about that, so I just need to avoid it. As opposed to like, notice this thing scares me, and kind of irrationally so, but we can still approach that doorway, but just just having a knowing that where your difficulties and strong suits are.
I'd also like to talk a moment about how others can use labels, and how that comes up a lot in social media. We started to talk about that earlier, but kind of backed off from it. So, and this kind of gets to mental health stigma a bit. And so one of the reasons why I mentioned that I go to a therapist and that I've been caught in depression, and there's been times where I admit criteria for social anxiety and these things, is because like it's so important to like see these things as being human. And one of the things that really frustrates me is that this used to happen a lot more with borderline, what we call borderline personality disorder. It happens a lot now with what we call narcissism. And I think it's really important to separate people being assholes from mental health diagnoses. There are a lot of people who are diagnosed with even sociopathy. So I've worked with people who are literal sociopaths, who are nice people who have not harmed anybody. In fact, I can't remember the person's name, and I wish you could do it, but there's a very famous researcher who was working. Do you know who I'm talking about?
Yeah, so cool.
Yeah, he's a very famous researcher who's lived a good life. He had a good career. He had a wife. Generally, he was admitting this publicly. So if he had lots of enemies, he probably would hesitate to do this. But he was going through these assessments, and he looked at his own assessment when he took it, and he came up as being a sociopath. That is, he did not suffer. He did not. So sociopaths have two kind of things happening. If they're a biological sociopath, there's also learned sociopathy, and that's a little bit different. But basically, they have less of a sense of emotional empathy for other people. So for me, that's really hard to imagine. I'm always trying to imagine, like I always kind of get hit by how people feel. But he wouldn't do that. And the other thing is, they tend not to feel punishment in the way that other human beings feel punishment. It's not aversive to them. So if someone were to call them a name, if the people were to hate them, they're less likely to hesitate because of that. And if they were to lose or go to prison, they're going to care less. But they are really motivated by reward, so they become very ambitious and controlling in many ways. And so he's a fairly well-adjusted guy. Same thing. I work with many individuals who have been diagnosed with borderline personality disorder, many individuals diagnosed with narcissism. And again, these are people who as children were either abused, traumatized, or neglected. And that is a trauma response. Before we talked about how PTSD happens in adults who have fully formed personalities. Well, the challenge is when you have extreme events happen to you when you're a child, your personality hasn't fully formed yet. So whatever way that you learn to cope and understand the world when you're 5 or 7 or 12 becomes how you just believe the world to be. And these, what we call these personality disorders, I prefer to call personality patterns, they give people blind spots because you just kind of assume that that's how the world is. And then sometimes get confused when other people are getting upset at you, or why it seems like other people think that you're responding in extreme ways. And again, I've worked with narcissists who are loving fathers, caring people. And I've worked with narcissists who are really destructive in the lives of other people. Same with borderline personality patterns. And so when I see people on, and I've seen mental health professionals like saying these people are horrible and they can't be fixed and can't be changed. That is absolutely not true. Anybody who's gone through trauma, whether they're a child or adult, if you can connect to what is really important to them, you can kind of create a change. And I want to say one more thing, then kind of wrap up. We didn't used to believe that borderline personality patterns were treatable until someone with borderline personality disorder, Marsha Linehan, developed a treatment that combined Zen with behavioral therapy and called it dialectical behavior therapy. She had borderline personality disorder. And then after that, it's like the 4-minute mile. Once the 4-minute mile was broke, we realized, oh, we can treat this. We don't need to stigmatize these people. Narcissism's the same way. Narcissists, and this is an oversimplification, but narcissists generally believe that in order to find connection and love, they need to be really good at stuff and they need to be special. And in a way that's true, because when we're special, when we're unique, when we have a particular strength, people are drawn to us and they notice us. But a lot of times what narcissists don't understand, what their blind spot is that that's not how connection is formed, because real connection happens between equals. It almost never happens from a one-up position. Now, and we all have these patterns in us. Every human being has elements of borderline, elements of narcissism, because they're just normal parts of us that are stuck in an extreme pattern until we begin to understand it and work through it. Like someone with PTSD can understand and work through those things.
I'm thinking of, I used to think of a sociopath as someone whose empathy gland didn't exist or wasn't working in their brain. And I've been seeing more and more. So there's empathy inducing experiences, right? And then there's prolonged held circumstances that will help you be a more empathic person, living in community, having more experiences where you're, feeling a call to be nurturing and it working out for both of you. Like, these things reward and then that snowballs and then the opposite thing can happen. And I see a lot of those, like, I'm not going to give a famous example, but there's a famous example right now of somebody that a lot of us observe to be quite narcissistic. And it's like, what? Look at his entire life. Where was the? It occurs to me that this person has had a lack of experiences with people, someone being sincere to them, and a lot more being rewarded for being more cutthroat and so could be a really controversial statement, but isn't ideal military training kind of like imbuing you with a selective sociopathy where it's like, don't empathy for anyone but your team?
So there's actually a really good book on that subject, and it's called On Killing. I can't remember the author, but it's one of the most powerful books I've ever read. I've read it multiple times, and I recommend it to anybody who's going to be working with people who have dealt with extreme violent situations. So if they're working with police officers, or they're working with the military, it's a really powerful book. And kind of like there's a lot that you said there. So I want to kind of back up a little bit. I want to differentiate between learned sociopathy and biological sociopathy, because if it's biological, then literally the way the person's brain's wired, they're going to have a very difficult time feeling emotional empathy. Though sometimes biological sociopaths can, or psychopaths can engage in cognitive empathy. That is, they can imagine how another person feels, but they're not going to be dissuaded from hurting somebody because they can imagining someone's going to be hurt. That's not a punishment to them.
Can you distinguish sociopathy from psychopathy?
There's loose definitions. They're different depending on who you ask. And so I probably should not have used two terms there because it complicates things a little bit. But generally I'd say sociopathy is more somebody who is, actually, I don't want to go too much into that because I think it confuses things. But let's just say biological versus learned sociopathy or psychopathy, either one.
Okay.
And basically is this: if I don't if I don't experience punishment, I don't mind if I hurt. So I don't necessarily mind if I hurt somebody else. So even if I have empathy, but I notice someone's feeling pain, it's not like it's like tissue paper. I'm not going to be hesitating that. But for someone who has real empathy for another human being, it'd be like walking through electrified razor wire if you're really hurting somebody and you're connected to them as a human being who you're hurting, right? Mm-hmm. So another way that we can learn sociopathy is by all or nothing or us versus them thinking, by dehumanizing people or vilifying them. And so this is why I really become cautious around people who really like to talk down, dehumanize, portray other people as being all bad, all wrong. Because the second we make someone that other, we make them a cartoon character, is the way I like to describe it. We can do anything to them. I remember I used to work at the Renaissance Festival, and the people who wore the helmets, like the giant king mask and the giant king head, they would always complain because all the kids would run up to them and start like hitting their knees with swords. And even though they were really in pain, the kids wouldn't stop because they didn't view them as a real human being. And we can choose to do that to other human beings. And I think that's what we do a lot of times when we say people are crazy or borderline or narcissistic, or they're this race or this profession or that profession, is it's a way for us to go, you're not actually a real person. So therefore, I'm not going to feel bad about hurting you. And that to me is a really scary process and phenomenon.
Well, I think that's a really good illustration of what it is to to experience trauma, not just a traumatic event, but a period of time where you are being wired and with purpose, being wired to defend yourself from the real situation that you will be in, like going to a combat zone. Mm-hmm. Like we're preparing, training a soldier is getting them ready to be more adapted for a situation where it will be green light to kill the enemy, but also have an intense felt sense of maybe empathy isn't always the word, but regard for your team, your people. Mm-hmm. And then we take them out of the situation and put them back in a relatively safe situation of society. And they're still there. Like what, of course that program is still going to be running to a degree.
Right. And this is why we need that, again, that flexible dynamic range, that adaptive dynamic range. So when I was teaching martial arts, I really cared for my students. I felt for my students, but I would, when I was a young instructor, I would do them a disservice by, when they got to a higher rank, I wouldn't hit them as hard as I should for their rank, for their level. And what happened was one of my students, I learned this very quickly, went out and they were in a situation where they stood up against somebody where they weren't ready to stand up, and they got hurt a lot worse than they ever would have in my studio. And at that point, I realized that I was doing them a disservice by not hitting them at the level that they were at when it was appropriate to do so with respect and care. And similarly, I ran into a similar problem where one time I was really drunk and someone who I thought was a friend sucker tackled me, and I had them in a partial triangle choke, and I had combat boots on. I could have kicked through sorry, we had some sound technical issues there. I could have actually kicked through their head, but I didn't do it because I'm like, friend, I can't do it to the friend, but this person was no longer a friend. And so I'm like, okay, well, next time in this situation, I'm going to adapt so I can defend myself properly. And so when that situation came up again, a different time in a different situation, and so that's why it has to be flexible and dynamic, that range is important, not one's good, one's bad.
Chris, you told me about that in your past there was a time where you would see like scary visions and have like reality tunnels that were like scary and with a etheric, magical element, and that you no longer experience that. Mm-hmm. and you feel like what you did or how you untangled that.
Yeah, for sure. It was the thing that really woke me up. Long story short, I had a lot of repressed anger in my life. And all that repressed anger eventually came to a head. I'd been repressing it for a long time to try and be a good dude, try to be a good guy, and not be the angry, borderline narcissistic asshole that I was, where I would just like use people and not really care and hurt people. So I put that all away to not do that anymore. And all that anger eventually came up, and it was making my thoughts really scary. I was having like visions of like violently murdering people that I cared about. And it was like very vivid visions in my head of like, I didn't have plans or anything, but I would just see these things and I'd be like, fuck, is that what I'm becoming? Like, I really don't want to become that. And so that like almost had me end my life because I was so afraid. But then I told a therapist and he just kind of laughed at me and he's like, that's really common, bud. And so I was like, oh, okay, well, if that's common, then we're either I'm better than we think or we're all screwed. So I had to figure out what to do with that. But for me, I found out all the anger was just about me feeling helpless and not standing up for myself. And so I letting all these people emotionally abuse me and all these people take advantage of me and never speaking up for myself because I didn't want to hurt anybody. Eventually, all the anger I felt from being harmed for so many years boiled to the point where it was like, all right, well, if you're not going to kill yourself, then we're going to have to kill everybody who's hurting you. And so I was like, wow, that's really fucking interesting. And so I started setting more boundaries. I started expressing my anger. I started taking Kung Fu, I joined a men's group. Started spinning fire, started doing all kinds of stuff to get my anger out. And then I started setting appropriate boundaries and distancing myself from people. And now that's a weird, distant memory for me. It's hard to believe that that's actually what my life was like less than 10 years ago. It was terror all the time.
And before you came on, Chris, we we're talking about how a lot of times when people feel like they're in this depression, this rage or this anger, that it just can't change, that there's no possibility of it, that it's going to stay that way forever. And I think that's a really good example of that is such an extreme. And like your therapist says, not uncommon way of thinking for human beings. This is why, again, as a martial artist, I always said, you want to try to avoid a fight whenever possible, because you have no idea what that other person's rules are or what's in their head. And that's only been proven true to me more and more as time's gone on, that pacifism has its advantages because people are in very dark places sometimes. But they're kind of showing that this kind of by kind of figuring out why that part of you was so extreme is because the rest of you wasn't sticking up for yourself, wasn't defending yourself. And so that other part was doing it in the most primal way it could imagine, literally.
Yeah. And it's like, to me, that made it absolutely clear that like your needs are going to get met one way or another. Like if you got a need, it's going to get met, and it's going to get met with your permission or without it. It doesn't matter.
Are full-fledged panic attacks, anxiety attacks, is that something that that denotes having anxiety patterns, or does everybody who has who struggles with anxiety have that and some don't? Because I've had that, and I have my sister recently had her first several after 33 years of life.
Yeah. So I actually came over and kind of
that was the first
kind of talked to her. Yeah. So Penny, and what I said to her at the time is like, hey, this is really common. Like there's a part of our body that when things go on, we can get caught in a feedback loop that takes the normal process of adrenaline and like sends it into overdrive. And it's a very quick version of that downward spiral or that upward spiral we're talking about. And a lot of times those panic attacks feel like they're coming out of the blue, but they're typically not. It's literally one of the most common causes for panic attacks is literally fear of fear. So if you start to have panic attacks, because they feel, this comes back to that concept of emotional reasoning that I talked about before, the fear feels so extreme, it feels like something horrible must be happening. I must be psychic and a comet must be heading for me, or death, the specter of death is above me, or I'm literally going to have a heart attack, or I'm going crazy. And it feels worse than almost anything you've ever felt before. So of course it's dangerous. So then the very fact that feeling is getting worse is what you're afraid of. And we like to, a metaphor I like to use is like a tin can monster. So if you got some tin cans in the dark and they get hooked around your foot and you start to walk and you hear this tin can monster behind you, you start to run, it gets louder and louder. The faster you go, the noisier it gets. And that's what causes panic. And so one of the best ways to reduce that is we teach people mindfulness. And that is learning how to kind of pause, notice how your mind is relating to itself in the circumstance. In this case, it's going, the fact that my heart's beating means I'm going to die. The fact that I'm sweating means that people think I'm a freak. The fact that my mouth is dry means I can't talk and ask for help. And you go, hey, we've experienced fear before, experienced panic attacks before, felt like I'm going to die before. We've experienced it. I'm going to focus on my breath. I'm not going to try to get this to feel good right away. I know it takes 10, 15 minutes for it to calm down, and you ride it out like you're riding a wave that was bigger than you thought when you're surfing. And eventually, if you kind of do that, that adrenaline starts to wind down by itself, and you start to leave that panic attack. And it's one of the panic disorder by itself, if it's not being caused by something deeper, is actually one of the easier things to treat. Through like just kind of behavioral mindfulness based or exposure therapy.
Exposure. Me and Chris have been doing. How many days are you on of cold shower and Wim Hof breathing?
8.
8.
I think so.
But it seems to be exponentially, like, my base state is feeling better as I'm doing this. There's a breathing technique, and then there's cold exposure. The thing I want to talk about that relates to this topic is the cold exposure is this mini hero's journey to willfully go into
uncomfortable states,
and there's stress associated with it. You know, tell some people like you're going to take a cold shower in January in Michigan. It's like, no, the fuck I'm not. And when you're approaching that, the first few times of doing that, it's, I can't believe I'm doing this. And there's so much negotiation going in my head. And now I'm having more of a momentum with this. I'm finding myself working more to have it not be just an experience of I'm doing this. There is no negotiation. That I like to take that moment before of like, I am stepping into something difficult and it won't be comfortable. And here we go. And I think that is such a therapeutic event for me to face stress. I did it today with, I have this strange thing. And I know, and I just recently heard a psychologist say that this is one of the things that can be a symptom of ADHD is like dwelling on something that just a social interaction that happened during the day, and you just can't get out of looping about that. Or I'll get incredibly anxious about a phone call with a friend. And it's just like this thing I'll put off forever. And then the thought of I have to call that person, have this little friendly exchange about, something logistical, and it'll bug me all day and it'll take up so much mental real estate. I did a cold shower just before making one of those phone calls. And it seemed to really help because it was like, I'm going into a very different stress. And then right afterward, I'm going to do this thing that's scaring me. And yeah, that willfully giving, and so there's exposure therapy of is there more than talking about? There's talk therapy of talking through a traumatic event, but then there's also like actually getting in a room with spiders.
Right. Yeah. Well, there's two different things. So what you're talking about with the cold shower is, I think, just something that's generally really powerful in our to do, given how we're raised in our culture, which it often says that uncomfortable things are bad and should be avoided. And that means depression is bad, should be avoided. Anxiety is bad and should be avoided. Frustration is bad, not knowing, feeling silly, feeling stupid, feeling embarrassed, feeling awkward, not knowing enough, feeling bored. And that we're so focused on not feeling these things, in part because I think a lot of times we view happiness or unhappiness as a scorecard. And this is another concept I want to get to. If we believe that if we're good and we're successful, that means we're happy, then when we're naturally have these other very extremely natural emotions, we're assuming that we're losing life. And there's been sometimes when I'm doing the most meaningful things in my life, I am really uncomfortable for months at a time. I'm doing hard work. I'm in an uncomfortable place. I'm trying something new, so I feel like a fool or I feel awkward. And it's only by pushing through that thing that I have all of these much more astounding, rich experiences in my life. So I think that when we practice things like that cold shower exposure, or we practice running if we don't have like joint problems, and we can just kind of push through that difficulty, and we can learn to do it time and time again, we're learning that we can sacrifice. And I mean, sacrifice by the root word of a sacrifice means to make sacred. We're making sacred in a moment of discomfort or giving up of something in order to achieve something that's more valuable to us. Does that kind of make sense in that end? And we can get to exposure.
Yeah. And with that of like the acceptance versus like facing something head on, I'm going to do everything I can to get to a better place is like really determined by your values and the situation that you're put in life.
And it really should be a rhythm, right? Because if we're uncomfortable and pushing ourselves all the time, we're going to burn out, right? So if you got an Olympic athlete and they're training 9 hours a day, 6 days a week, they're not necessarily going to get any better by going to 12 hours a day, 7 days a week. They're going to burn out and get an injury. But exposure, what you're talking about, is something really different, and it's really effective, and it's really powerful. So the idea here is negative emotions, especially, come with what we call behavioral action tendencies. So if I'm walking down the road and somebody smacks me and I become angry, I am more likely to clench my fist, imagine horrible things about them, puff up my chest, and be ready to hit them while I'm swearing at them than I am to imagine baking cupcakes. And the reason is that anger narrows down our behavioral repertoire, so we're more likely to do something that's adaptive for our ancestors. And so with a behavioral action tendency for anxiety or fear is to avoid that thing. Because if we're afraid of it, it's likely bad, and we better have a damn good reason to approach it. Otherwise, we're just going to hurt ourselves for no reason. So again, if there was no honey in the beehive, nobody would be messed with bees, right? Because we'd have anxiety about getting stung, and that is protective to the bee and protective for us. But once we realize that there's honey there, our ancestors learned how to deal with the pain of the sting because there's something worthwhile. So kind of think about it this way. If you're a young kid and you think there's a monster under the bed or in the closet, and you run past the closet and you jump over the bed and you get under the covers and you put the blanket over your head, are you going to be less scared of that monster the next day?
Yeah, if I have an experience where something that I thought was surely going to be my doom and it's survivable or pleasant, sometimes you can find that there's something that has a great reward that you thought that the danger of it was so high that you'll never be able to reach that pot of honey. And the sting isn't as bad as you thought. That also helps things be less.
Right. But if you're a kid and you run by that closet and you don't look in the closet, you're going to be just as scared of that closet the next night, if not more so.
More mystery.
Right. Yeah. So they actually do exposure, and you can actually see this online. So if you look up flooding exposure snakes, if you don't have a snake phobia, or flooding exposure spiders, if you have a spider phobia, that they have videos online of clinical psychologists. You want to find clinical psychologists who are doing this. And they will incrementally expose people to the feared things. So there's a very famous video by Edward Foa. She's one of the preeminent exposure therapists that developed this approach. And she got a grad student to demonstrate this. This grad student had a fear of snakes. So they started by mentioning snake, and they mentioned, so yeah, we've lost Chris, and I think we'll have to get him back another time. And then, so they kind of start mentioning steaks, and they talk about it so much, and they tell her to imagine holding it, and she starts to cry and gets upset, and her body calms down and she gets over it. And then they give her a rubber snake, and she starts to cry and get upset. And then they give her, there's a snake, a rubber, like it starts with a rubber snake at the end of the room, then closer, then she's holding it. Then they do it with the garter snake in a cage, and she's freaking out. And then they put her in a room full of snakes. In cages, and it looks like the Blair Witch Project. She has snot going down her face. She's crying. And by the end of the day, she has a boa constrictor around her neck, and she's fine, and she's smiling, and she's happy, and she's completely exhausted, but she got through it. And we do this in therapy all the time, and we call it systematic and incremental exposure. The key is that you want to make sure that the person stays safe, because if they have a experience showing that whatever they're doing is dangerous while it's happening, it's going to justify that fear. And eventually they realize that, yeah, I should be afraid of things that truly are dangerous, but garter snakes are neither going to give me poison or strangle me. They're okay. And I can kind of get through it.
Yeah. Back to, so in layman's term, what I understand what MDMA assisted therapy is is we're going to induce a state where someone's brain is gushing all the trust stuff and almost like incapable of the fear responses. And now we talk about the traumatic event, or we have an exposure event. And in this state, this opportunity to face this with kind of an artificial neurochemically induced temporary state of bravery, of no fear. On the other side of that, you'll have to integrate that you did go near the thing of your fear, and you survived. Now on the other, on day 3 of that, like you after, and you return to your usual state, you may not immediately, all of a sudden feel all right with this because you had this one event, but it nudges you. And that's how I see my that it's about moving the needle.
I think it's in part that, but here's the thing: people can feel fear and do feel fear when they are experiencing something like MDMA. But what I think one of the unique things about MDMA is that it tends to create a sense of compassion and love. And that this is one of the big things that we work a lot with in therapy generally is, and Chris has talked about this, is how we relate to ourselves is so important. So a lot of times when people try to, the way that they learned how to control themselves when they're younger is that they were modeled from the people around them. So if you used to get angry and that you weren't allowed to do that, so you might get angry at yourself for being angry. Or if you thought that you could never be afraid, so you yell at yourself when you get afraid, and then you would do the opposite and you're angry instead every time you felt fear, and you're terrorizing the people around you. That what MDMA can allow you to do is to have compassion and empathy for how you've been reacting to things, can be understanding and have compassion and empathy for the pain that you went through, and then to have hope that there's other ways of responding to things. Mm-hmm. And again, this is what I think many good therapies do, whether they involve something like a substance or not, is how do you help people understand, how do you feel the full range of things? How do you be compassionate to these things that you used to judge in yourself? And how do you then look at the world as having options available to you so that you can do other things that both keep you safe and allow you to be effective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I thought of this isn't my memory, but a friend of mine had an anecdote of that going in a stupid way, where they had a very unofficial, very unsupervised rogue MDMA therapy, or taking MDMA at a cabin, and there was a hornet's nest in the cabin, and in their state of overwhelming empathy and love and no anxiety, no fear of a real considerable danger. They took turns going and essentially getting themselves stung to have a moment of connection with the hornets. Now, this
probably wasn't very good for the hornets either. I'm going to take it.
Yeah, because don't they die? It's wasps that survive.
Yeah, I think they might die.
Yeah, wasps can get you multiple times. Anyway, the consequence of this wasn't so huge. Well, if somebody was allergic to bee stings, that would be a real problem. Yeah. But the next day they had bee sting wounds in the moment of the experience. It's just, oh, this is nice. But that is what can go wrong, is approaching something that is actually dangerous. Well, yeah, actually dangerous. I misspoke there. Because you ever heard this phrase? I say this a lot. I don't know who said this, but if you have a real problem, you need a real solution. If you have an imaginary problem, you may need an imaginary solution. That's like how I think of therapy. Is imaginary isn't the word that you want to say, but it's like you need an experiential solution to this, because it's an experience that you're having.
Yeah. And so again, the main form of therapy that I work with, and I work with several, because this is not the end all be all, is acceptance and commitment therapy. And it's really based on teaching people how to have experiences in the room and in their life to allow them to relate to things in new ways. And I guess one of the things that sometimes concerns me when people are talking about MDMA therapy or things like this is people can feel it's the drug, not them, that had the realization. So if you can help people have a compassionate, open feeling in themselves because they're doing loving kindness meditation. They're practicing it for 3 weeks, or they're doing what's called Nikon therapy, which is really astounding. It helps you kind of understand your interconnectedness to things around you, developed in Japan, that you know that it was you that did that. And it wasn't because of the substance. And so then, you can access that anytime you need to, because our behavior patterns, our mental patterns, our emotional patterns, they're habits. So unless you can practice things over and over again, I find one-off things don't always stick. And this is kind of what makes these more modern behavioral therapies different from what we used to call insight-oriented therapies. So these insight-oriented therapies said, if you have a realization, then your life will change. And what I find is that when you have a realization and you practice that in your life is going to change as long as you practice it until it becomes second nature.
Yeah. That is integration.
Mm-hmm.
I had a series of years in my life where I was having so much realization, so many epiphanies, too many goddamn epiphanies.
So many. I've been there.
You may have been present for several moments of.
I've also been the one doing that. So.
Yeah, I thought I figured it out. Oh, and now everything will change. But when I didn't have the terminology or just the understanding in my head that the integration part, that's actual work.
Yeah.
And another way of saying integrate, to ground into behaviors.
Right. And so I posted on Facebook like 3 months ago. I'm like, this is fucking huge. I've been looking for this my whole life. And I haven't posted, I posted a little bit about it since, but I haven't posted more because I'm still doing the work from that realization 3 months ago. And it's spot on. My life is changing in ways that I've been stuck in for decades. And then all the other stuff that I've learned hasn't got at it, but this part did, and it is bearing fruit, but it's only bearing fruit because I try to come back and practice it every day. And the more I do it, the easier it gets. And a lot of that kind of goes back to some of the stuff that Chris does. So it's the stuff that he kind of turned his life around with a few years ago. I've discovered that kind of on my own 3 months ago, and it's really solid stuff.
Andy says, clinging to a pattern as an identity helps keep someone in that pattern. I can't imagine that it is a good way to get out of that pattern. I wanted to ask you, Eric, as a clinician,
mm-hmm.
what do you think of? And I don't know if there's a hesitancy to give advice unofficially like this or any kind of mass advice, but what do you think of self-diagnosis? Because there's a lot of that going on.
Well, I think people are going to do it anyway. We're all psychologists because we're working with people and ourselves every day, and we have an understanding of ourselves and other people.
Yeah.
So whether or not, but the reason why I, as a psychologist, see a therapist is because I understand myself well enough to know that I have blind spots, as do all other human beings. Mm-hmm. So by working with somebody who's both compassionate and will call me on my shit, I am going to make more progress than I would if I'm just trying to do this on my own, or I'm going to friends who are going to have their own perspectives, but they're maybe not going to come from this place of humble expertise. And that's how I like to kind of think about myself as a therapist is I have a great deal of understanding about tools people can use in psychological theory, but I still need to get to know the person I'm working with and understand all of the good reasons for the decisions that they've made every day up to the point that I've met them and they're still making today. Because here's the thing, if we're doing something, even if it's problematic in our life, we're doing it because it works for us in some way. And so when we self-diagnose, we can get an idea of what's going on with us. But I really like the term holding things lightly, because this comes back to the idea that adaptive dynamic range. So if I say, there's been times in my life where I would meet criteria for social anxiety disorder. And today, when I go into some situations, I'm going to experience anxiety, but it doesn't mean that I currently have social anxiety disorder. Having anxiety is like, if you have full color vision, it's like seeing the color blue. If you have a functioning limbic system, you're probably going to feel every single emotion there is to feel during a week. Mm-hmm. It's just a question of how long. Just like if you have a working eye, you're going to see every color that you come across. So again, the challenge in diagnosing yourself is, one, how much weight do you put behind it? And how much do you allow what changes in your life to change the label you put on yourself?
Yeah, and because when people self-diagnose, often one announces it to the community, sometimes constantly, sometimes predicating a lot of observations about their own behavior as well. It's just my, and that can be such that can reinforce the problem so much. And I think it's just it's important to note that there is an appropriate level of anxiety to feel just from being alive.
Yeah, exactly. And it's true with anger, sadness, feeling stupid, uncertain, unsure, bored. Like these are part, as well as all of the positive emotions, that these are all part of the normal human experience. The challenge is when we get caught in a very depressed or very anxious place, that some of the first thing that happen is, I think this is a really important concept. So negative emotions are triggered by alarm signals. Positive emotions are triggered by signals of security, comfort, and abundance. So if we feel like we truly are in an emergency, it will be harder to feel a range of positive emotions. However, if we can get unstuck from that place of constant emergency, then we're going to come back to feeling that full range of both positive and negative emotions again. So the problem is when we're trying to get rid of and not have the negative emotions, we run into what's called the white bear effect. So don't think about a white bear. Right?
I say this is don't think about a cat.
Exactly. And it's even worse because the more dangerous something is, the more naturally we feel anxiety about it. So if we don't feel anxious because anxiety is dangerous or it means there's something wrong with you, what are you going to feel about anxiety? Anxiety, fear. And that's part of how we get trapped. So the way out of that trap, and I think this is very important, and maybe this is the concept we can end on. So this kind of comes back to part of the reason why I look to ACT, acceptance commitment therapy, as my main form, which is it's the opposite of the medical model. We're not trying to get people to be average or normal or unbroken or fix them. We're asking, who are you? What if you look at the full range of your life and you can live fully in all of the areas of your life, given your circumstance and the time and energy you have available? How would you live? So in terms of fitness, not because of other people, not because of rules, not because of what you've been taught, what would it mean for you to be fully in tune with your body and living an active, fit lifestyle in your life? For you, that actually might be sitting on the couch. It might be running a marathon. It's going to be different for every person. Same thing with food. Do you want to eat food just because it tastes good in the moment? Or do you also want to eat food that feels good in your body an hour later? In terms of, because your mom said you're good at math, so do you need to be a CAPA down stuck in a cubicle in a basement? If what you really do is you feel alive when you're outdoors and you're working with other people, maybe you should be poorer and be a park ranger instead, because money actually isn't that important to you, even though it was really important to your mom who thought you're good at math. And so here's the other thing. Sometimes people come to me and they're like, they are that CPA in the basement and they are the person who'd rather be in the woods. And they're like, I want to fix my anxiety. And then I ask them about their life. I'm like, dude, your anxiety is right on. It's telling you fucking hate your job. Maybe you need to be out in the woods with Smokey the Bear.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, not forcing yourself. So on that spectrum of too much settling in and reinforcing your pattern, and then on the other side, doing too much to wriggle out of it in a way that is maybe hurting you more. That is like an unrealistic pace that is also like painful and anxiety inducing. I think of this concept that like this is my advice, because this has helped a lot for me. So there's this thing in language learning, the idea of you have someone that you go and speak in your target language who is the stickler, who's going to correct you at every moment that you make a mistake. And then you have someone that is more easygoing, that is just going to like, all right, I understood you, move along. And they're not going to be calling out those grammar errors and those small things. And you need each at different time, because sometimes it's really helpful to get that effort and reward and feeling like, wow, I'm really doing it. This is making it, this is progressing you in a certain way. And then other times, like, you need to get, hit on the hand with the ruler and nope, it's this way. And I think doing that with your mental health and your progress like you like with me with ADHD, like I identify this pattern, and sometimes it helps me. Like I came up with this metaphor the other day of the coin pusher game. There was this game where there's all these tokens, and you put a token in, and they accumulate, and then at some point they have an avalanche over this ledge, and then you get tickets. And this was the game at all the Dave and Buster's, Major Magics, whatever places, Leaps and Bounds, places like that. There were arcades, and to see my progress as that makes me feel so much less broken about having my brain be this way. So that's when I need nurture, I will go to that angel on my shoulder. But I also do want to have little Jordan Peterson on my left shoulder, who's like, you're not what you could be. Clean your room. You can be more than this. You can realize your potential, and that it's not one or the other. It's
yes, and it's both
at different times. Yeah.
And that's that adaptive dynamic range that we're talking about. And I think this is one of the most kind of important things that I've gotten out of us doing this podcast is that term. And it's that idea that driven, pushing, non-accepting, you got to achieve, you got to analyze, you got to figure this out, problem solving part of yourself is as valuable and is on the same team with that compassionate, understanding, accepting, you can take a break right now piece. And when those two parts of yourself are communicating and they are working together, then you end up getting a rhythm where one goes, that tags out and goes, okay, we're going to chill now. We're going to enjoy ourselves. We're going to sit in that sauna. we're going to just listen to some good music, and we're going to let my body and mind recover, enjoy this, and achieve, like, enjoy the success. And then after a while, it's like, I feel refreshed. Let's get back at it. We're going to go back to work. We're going to get this shit done. I'm going to build. I'm going to get better. I'm going to grow. And that's that dialectic between acceptance and change.
Yeah.
And it's that adaptability. I think it's when we get stuck where our problem becomes an issue. And when we feel that one side's good and one side's bad, that's part of how we get stuck.
Yeah. And that, like you said, about the job that is causing you to be anxious often. And it's like, whether or not that is evidence that you need to find a new job or find a new living situation, that choice is yours. I think about I sometimes think I need to move out of the city. I can't live in a city. I'm too much of a scaredy cat. Or just being around too much stimulus, having too many opportunities. I had too many opportunities to be distracted by fun.
Right.
That there's times where it's like I must change my situation, and then there's other times where it's like I need to change it would benefit me to change my internal situation.
Right.
I can be in this circumstance, but that's really that's up to you, and that's yeah, that really depends on circumstances, as everything does.
Yeah. And for me, it was like, I would make big events or big projects every 3 years because for 9 months of my life, I would be just pushing myself so hard and it'd be so miserable in myself. But then there'd be this amazing creation with tons of people who I love and I admire. And we got to do this great, amazing thing together. And then I'm freaking burnt out. I don't want that responsibility. I don't want to put that sort of sacrifice in. And so for 3 years, I do other things and use my time other ways. And then I come back to it again. And I come back to it again because I love and I value that. And it's worth that sacrifice and it's worth that pain. But I don't want my whole life to be that sacrifice and pain. There's so many other things I want to enjoy.
Mm-hmm. And with me, with my distractibility pattern, it's like I want to serve the world with a version of me that can do things like commitment and single point focus when the situation calls for it. But I also don't want to leave the superpower. I don't want to entirely lose the capacity for this, what could also be described as just tremendous openness and a readiness to respond and become interested. Like that is the wealth of the world. I notice sometimes is like there's some of us who have struggle with genuine interest, and I can become genuinely interested easily. Sometimes that manifests as, chasing every squirrel when there's something really important that we should focus on. Yeah. So it's a bit of both, but I believe now with every day, and with this conversation has helped, that there really is is hope to move the needle, and also at the same time, it's more than okay to be special.
Yes. Yes. I think that's exactly the point. And for me, my whole life, like the person who I was and the patterns I was caught up in my teens and 20s, like if I hadn't pushed through those things and I haven't found ways to work with those things, I still could have easily been stuck in that social anxiety, that frustration with the world around me, that depression. And there's been times since then where I've fallen into those holes because all human beings do so. And that's the beautiful thing, is after you start climbing out enough, you realize that when you fall in again, you can find a way back out. And when you do that, this is where you can also go to other people. Yes, there really is hope on the other side of this, because it's possible to get through. And one thing I want to say to that, can maybe kind of wrap up around here, is there's that part of you that's afraid maybe that if you become structured and organized, that you're going to lose that other part of you. And I think that this idea of dialectics and this part work that, and the shadow work that Chris is talking about, and then I've found in a new way in myself 3 months ago, is what I've always told my trauma patients, especially my military trauma patients, is I go, one thing I want to guarantee you is I'm not going to try to get rid of the part of you that's angry. I'm not going to try to get rid of the part of you that has the ability to be violent. I'm not going to get rid of the part of you. We're not going to work to get rid of the part of you that has the ability to defend yourself and be violent. That those are not the problem. They have saved you. They have served you. And if you felt like they weren't available to you then, they can be available to you in the right time. Again, I'm also coming from the perspective as someone who taught self-defense. And the thing is that they can coexist with these other parts of you. And you can both get to a part, those different aspects of yourself can get to a part where you can enjoy life and relax and still be aware rather than always alert. Mm-hmm. And the same thing is that I am an extremely creative person. And one of the most painful things in the world for me to do was to sit down in a graduate program where the people around me had such an easier time focusing. Were such better spellers than me. They could type at a computer uninterrupted for hours. I would see them do it. And that's almost impossible for me. But by pushing through it, I developed it more, and I kept that creative element in my life. And it's finding that dynamic range and honoring both parts of yourself that I think a lot of times allow us to move forward, is by valuing that part of ourself that's hurting or that we felt was the problem, because it is that superpower, but it's not the superpower, but it's also a problem if it's trying to run the show by itself. So if our hurt part is trying to run the show by itself, our scared part, our creative part, our free part, that if it's not balanced by that other end of the dialectic and you don't honor that as well, this is, I think, where a lot of times where we do get stuck.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And there's a lot that you can do to change your life circumstance, but one that is, well, it's not impossible, but there's going to be some unpredictability and chaos and various stimuli that's going to come at you in life. Mm-hmm. Tuning your instrument to be more adaptable to that is a worthy effort. I would say. So
I'd like to wrap up. I am not in private practice, so I'm not taking on clients. But if you like some of the ideas that we talked about today, some of the things that we're discussing, a lot of the concepts I'm coming from are coming from what's called acceptance and commitment therapy. When we're talking about these parts work, that comes from a form of therapy that works with that a lot, is called internal family systems, and looking at the different parts of yourself like they're a family. That if you like the idea and like the books on that, there's some really good books on acceptance commitment therapy by someone called Russ Harris. He's an Australian medical doctor that took what was a very complicated therapy and made it very simple. You can find him on Amazon. One of his early books is called The Happiness Trap, and it kind of warns against using happiness as a scorecard. And then again, if you ever find yourself really stuck and need someone to talk to, you can always Google crisis line. And whether it's a text or it's a call-in line, sometimes it's good to reach out to somebody when you're feeling overwhelmed, especially when we have situations with COVID and we're feeling isolated and it's easy to feel separate from other people. So really good engaging with all you guys out there. Good talking to you and Chris as always.
Yeah. And there was, and this moment, this era, there is a reason why we chose this topic now. There's actual stimuli in the world. And just as a very general statement, I hope everybody's doing well. And also if you're not feeling so well, that
it's normal. It's coming.
I
think a lot of people for the people who aren't used to feeling anxious, depressed, and lonely, I think that kind of universally most and overwhelmed. I think many of us have felt that way over the last year, and it's kind of what it is to be human.
Definitely at times and waves. Yeah,
for sure. Good night, everybody. Cheers.
Take care, everybody. Happy reality.